The First Trees. Tonight, we return once more to the quiet frontier, a land of tall pine forests and cold rivers where the wind moves softly through the mountains and the days pass according to the steady rhythm of wilderness life. Our story continues with a young trapper still learning that rhythm. His name is William, and today his work begins in earnest. The small camp beside the river stirred slowly to life beneath the pale grey light of early morning. The sky above the valley had not yet brightened fully, but the faintest glow of sunrise had begun creeping along the eastern ridge. The forest still held the cool breath of night, and a thin layer of frost clung to the grasses near the riverbank. William sat beside his fire, rubbing his hands slowly together while the flames licked at the fresh pieces of oak he had added moments earlier. The warmth crept into his fingers little by little. Cold mornings like this had become familiar. The mountains wasted no time reminding a man that winter was drawing closer with each passing day. William leaned forward and lifted the kettle from the fire. Steam curled upward into the still morning air as he poured a small portion of hot water into his tin cup. The warmth of the metal seeped into his palms as he held it close. For a moment he simply sat there watching the river. Mist drifted across the surface again, thin strands of white rising slowly as the morning air warmed. The quiet current slipped past the rocks and roots along the bank just as it had the day before, and the day before that. Rivers never hurried, they simply continued moving. William took a slow drink. Today would not be a day for traps. The trapline could wait. 3 good pelts already hung, drying beside the fallen log near camp, and the river would still hold beavers tomorrow. Today belonged to a different kind of work. Cabin work. William set the cup aside and stood, stretching his arms slowly over his head. His shoulders popped quietly. The muscles in his back felt stiff from the previous day's work of hauling wood and skinning pelts, but the stiffness faded as he rolled his shoulders and flexed his hands. Hard work had a way of loosening the body once it truly began. He stepped over to the log where the pelts rested. The hides had dried nicely overnight. The morning frost had stiffened them slightly, but that was nothing unusual. He adjusted one of the wooden pegs and brushed a few pine needles away from the boards before leaning them safely against the tree again. Satisfied, he gathered his tools. The hatchet hung from his belt. His long rifle rested across his shoulder, and in his right hand he carried the axe. The axe was the most important tool he owned for the task ahead. Its iron head was worn smooth from years of use before it ever came into William's hands. Whitlock had traded for it from another trapper during the previous winter. "Take care of that one," Whitlock had said. "Good steel like this isn't easy to come by." William had taken those words seriously. The axe had been sharpened carefully the night before until the edge gleamed faintly in the firelight. Today it would taste pine wood. William turned toward the river and crossed the familiar stones once more. The cold water moved quietly beneath his boots. On the far bank, the forest rose gently toward the clearing he had chosen the day before. The cabin site. His cabin. The walk through the trees felt different this morning. Yesterday he had been scouting. Today he was building. The clearing appeared between the pines exactly as he remembered it. Soft moss covered the ground. The stream trickled quietly just beyond the rise, and tall, straight trees stood patiently all around, waiting to become the walls of the shelter that would soon stand here. William stepped into the centre of the clearing and looked around slowly. The small stick he had placed in the ground the evening before still stood there, marking the heart of the cabin. He nodded to himself. Right here. The wind moved softly through the tops of the pines. Somewhere in the distance a raven called. William walked to the edge of the clearing and rested his hand against the first tree he intended to cut. It was a tall lodgepole pine, straight, strong, nearly perfect for a cabin log. Whitlock had once explained why such trees were favoured by trappers. Straight trunks mean tighter walls, the old man had said, and tight walls keep the cold outside where it belongs. William stepped back and studied the tree carefully. When cutting timber alone, direction mattered. A falling tree could easily crush tools. Or worse. He studied the lean of the trunk, the direction of the branches, the open ground beside it. Finally he nodded. "This one'll do." William gripped the axe firmly in both hands. The first swing rang through the forest with a sharp crack as steel bit into pine. The sound echoed softly among The sound of the axe continued ringing through the clearing. Steel struck wood again and again, each swing biting deeper into the base of the tall pine. Chips of pale wood scattered across the moss like curled shavings of bone, their fresh scent filling the cool morning air. William worked steadily. Swing, strike, pull free. The rhythm of chopping had a way of settling into the body. After the first few minutes, the movement became almost automatic, guided by the quiet strength of shoulders and arms that had grown used to the work. Soon a wedge-shaped cut had formed in the trunk. William paused for a moment to catch his breath. Thin clouds of steam drifted from his mouth as he leaned on the axe handle and studied the tree. The cut looked good, clean, even, just the way Whitlock had taught him. He walked around the trunk to begin the second cut that would send the tree falling in the direction he wanted. But as he stepped to the other side of the pine, something caught his eye. A series of shallow marks cut into the bark. William frowned slightly and leaned closer. The marks were old, very old. The bark around them had begun growing back along the edges, softening the lines where the blade had once bitten into the wood. But the carving itself was still visible, a shape, crude but deliberate. William brushed a bit of loose bark away with his fingers. The carving showed two crossed lines. Beneath them, another mark that looked almost like the letter W, though the edges were rough and uneven. William straightened slowly. "Well now," he murmured. Someone had been here before. That was not unusual. The frontier was vast, but trappers had been moving through these mountains for decades. Rivers and streams often became quiet highways for men searching for fur-rich country. Still, finding a carving like this meant someone had spent time here. Maybe even built a camp. William stepped back and looked around the clearing again. The trees stood tall and quiet as before. The moss-covered ground showed no sign of old foundations or fire pits. If another trapper had lived here once, time had erased most of the evidence. William reached out and ran his hand lightly across the carving. The wood inside the cuts felt smooth from years of weather. "Wonder who you were," he said quietly. Trappers often left marks like this. Sometimes they carved their initials into trees near their trap lines to claim a territory. Other times they simply left a symbol behind as proof they had passed through a place. A quiet signature in the wilderness. William looked toward the stream again. If someone had chosen this clearing once before, it meant his instincts had been right. Good water, good timber, a solid place for a cabin. "Guess we both had the same idea," he said softly to the old carving. Then he stepped back to finish cutting the tree. The axe rose again. Steel struck wood once more, sending another shower of pale chips scattering across the ground. The cut deepened quickly now. The pine began to creak faintly as the trunk weakened. William worked carefully. A falling tree demanded respect. The final few swings came slower as he listened to the subtle sounds moving through the wood. A long crack echoed softly through the clearing. The tree began to lean. William stepped back quickly. The tall pine tipped slowly at first. Then gravity took hold. Branches scraped against neighbouring trees as the trunk crashed to the ground with a deep, echoing thud that rolled through the forest. William let out a quiet breath. "First log," he said. He walked forward and examined the fallen trunk. A good tree, straight, long, nearly perfect for one of the cabin walls. William lifted the axe again and began trimming away the branches, each cut sending fresh needles drifting down across the moss. The work was steady, methodical. And after a few minutes, the trunk lay clean and smooth along the forest floor. William shifted his grip on the axe and prepared to begin cutting the log into the proper length. He raised the tool once more. The blade came down sharply, but this time the sound was different. Instead of the solid crack of steel biting into wood, there came a dull metallic clatter. The axe head flew free from the handle and landed several feet away in the moss. William froze. For a moment he simply stared. Then he looked down at the wooden handle still resting in his hands. The top of the haft had split slightly where the iron head had once been wedged tight. "Well," he said after a moment, "that's not ideal." The clearing fell quiet again as William walked over and picked up the heavy iron axe head from the ground. The steel itself looked fine. No cracks, no chips, just the empty eye where the wooden handle had once fit. William turned the broken handle in his hands and shook his head. "Axe handles don't last forever," Whitlock had once told him. "Good news is, the forest grows plenty of replacements." William glanced toward the surrounding trees. Somewhere among them stood the piece of wood that would become his new axe handle. The cabin could wait a little longer. First, he would need to make himself a proper tool again. William turned the broken axe handle slowly in his hands. The wood had split cleanly along the grain where the iron head had loosened. A narrow crack ran several inches down the haft, widening just enough that the steel could no longer hold firmly in place. He ran his thumb along the break and nodded quietly. The tool had done its job for many years. Wood like that rarely lasted forever. Whitlock had warned him about this sort of thing the previous winter while they worked beside the old cabin. "Every axe handle breaks eventually," the old trapper had said. "It's just the way of it." Then he had lifted his own axe and tapped the handle gently against a log. "The trick isn't stopping it from breaking. The trick is knowing how to make another one." William looked out across the trees surrounding the clearing. Somewhere among them stood the wood he needed. Not just any wood would do. An axe handle had to be strong, flexible, tough enough to absorb the shock of every swing without snapping under pressure. The wrong type of wood could shatter after only a few strikes. Whitlock had explained the best choices clearly. "Hickory's the best if you can find it," he had said. "Strong grain, bends before it breaks. But ash works nearly as well. Straight grain, tough fibres." William began walking slowly through the trees. The forest here was mostly pine and spruce, tall evergreens that reached toward the sky in long, straight trunks. They made excellent cabin logs but poor tool handles. A good axe handle needed hard wood. He moved farther along the edge of the clearing, stepping carefully through patches of moss and fallen needles. The morning sun filtered through the trees now, casting warm beams of light across the forest floor. A small breeze stirred the branches above, sending a quiet whisper through the canopy. After several minutes, William spotted what he was looking for. A young ash tree stood among the pines, not too thick, perhaps the width of his forearm, just about right. He walked closer and ran his hand along the bark. Ash wood was known for its long, straight grain. That grain gave the wood both strength and flexibility, making it ideal for tool handles used in heavy work. William studied the trunk carefully. No twisting, no knots. A clean, straight section of wood nearly 5 feet long. Perfect. "This'll do nicely," he said quietly. He set the broken axe handle aside and reached for his hatchet. The smaller tool would handle this job easily. The hatchet blade flashed briefly in the sunlight as he swung. The sharp edge bit into the ash with a clean crack. A few more strikes followed, each one sending thin chips of pale wood falling into the grass below. Within a minute the young tree leaned. Then it tipped and fell gently across the forest floor. William crouched beside it and began trimming away the smaller branches. The hatchet worked quickly, snapping through the thin limbs with efficient strokes. Soon he had a straight length of wood resting across his knees. The piece measured roughly the length of his arm. Good starting point. But shaping it into a proper axe handle would take some careful work. William returned to the clearing and sat on a fallen log near the pine he had cut earlier. He set the ash branch across his lap and pulled his knife from its sheath. The blade caught the light briefly as he began shaving away the outer bark. Thin strips curled away from the wood as he worked. The pale surface beneath revealed the tight grain Whitlock had spoken about. Straight lines running the entire length of the wood. Exactly what he wanted. William worked slowly, carefully, shaping the wood little by little. The handle would need to taper slightly near the end where it fit into the axe head. Too thin, and it would snap. Too thick, and the iron would not slide into place. The quiet rhythm of carving settled over the clearing. Small curls of wood gathered at William's feet. The smell of fresh ash drifted through the air. Every few minutes he lifted the iron axe head and tested the fit against the shaped wood. Not yet. Still too thick, more shaving, more smoothing. The process could not be rushed. A poorly shaped handle might split the first time the axe struck a log. William continued carving patiently. The afternoon sun crept slowly across the clearing while he worked. Eventually the wood reached the proper shape. William slid the axe head carefully onto the tapered end. The iron settled snugly against the shoulder of the handle. Good. But the tool still needed one more piece. The wedge. A small wooden wedge driven into the top of the handle would spread the wood slightly, locking the iron head firmly into place. William carved the wedge from a leftover piece of ash. Then he positioned it carefully into the narrow slit he'd cut at the top of the handle. He lifted a small stone from the ground and tapped the wedge gently. The wood slid deeper. The handle widened slightly within the eye of the axe head. Another tap, then another. Finally the wedge seated firmly. William lifted the axe and tested its weight. The tool felt solid in his hands once again. Balanced. Ready. He swung it lightly toward the fallen pine. The blade bit cleanly into the wood with a satisfying crack. William smiled. That'll do. He rested the axe across his shoulder and looked around the clearing once more. The fallen pine still waited where it lay. The first log of his cabin. Now the work could begin again. And this time, his axe was ready for it. William stood slowly from the fallen log and rolled his shoulders once more. The afternoon sun had begun drifting westward across the sky, and the clearing now held that warm golden light that often settled over the mountains in the later hours of the day. The forest smelled strongly of fresh pine where the first tree had fallen earlier. The trunk still lay where it had dropped, long, straight. A perfect beginning for the walls of a cabin. William walked over to it and rested one boot against the bark. Cabin building required more than simply cutting trees and stacking them on top of one another. Each log had to be trimmed, measured, and shaped so that it rested tightly against the others. A poorly fitted wall allowed wind to creep through the cracks, and winter winds in these mountains had a way of finding every gap left by careless hands. Whitlock had explained it once in his usual simple way. Logs don't keep the cold out, he had said. Good fitting does. William lifted the axe and began trimming the remaining knots where the branches had been cut away. Each strike knocked loose small nubs of wood until the trunk became smooth along its length. The blade rang softly against the pine. The work was steady and calm. He moved along the trunk slowly, clearing each branch stub until the entire log lay clean before him. Once that was finished, William stepped back and studied the tree. Now came the question of length. He walked several paces across the clearing, measuring the distance roughly with his steps. Each stride marked the future walls of the cabin in his mind. 10 feet, 12 feet. Whitlock's cabin had been somewhere between the two. Small cabins stayed warmer during winter. Too large and the fire struggled to heat the space. Too small and a man quickly ran out of the room for tools, supplies, and the furs he might store through the season. William nodded to himself. 12 feet would do nicely. He returned to the trunk and marked the spot with the edge of his axe. Then he raised the tool again. The first strike bit deeply into the pine. The fresh handle he had carved earlier absorbed the shock well, the ashwood flexing slightly beneath his grip just as Whitlock had promised. William settled into the rhythm again. Swing, strike, pull free. The sound of chopping echoed gently among the trees. A small pile of wood chips grew around his boots as the cut deepened into the trunk. After several minutes, the axe finally bit all the way through. The log separated with a dull crack and rolled slightly along the mossy ground. William set the axe aside and examined the piece. Heavy, very heavy. A single pine log of that size easily weighed several 100 pounds. Moving it alone would require some thought. Whitlock had shown him a trick during the previous winter when they gathered logs for repairing the old cabin roof. Logs roll easier than they lift, the old trapper had said. He had demonstrated by placing a sturdy branch beneath the trunk and pushing steadily until the log began to turn. William remembered the lesson clearly. He walked to the edge of the clearing and cut a straight branch nearly 6 feet long. The branch would serve as a simple lever. Returning to the log, he wedged the stick beneath the trunk and pushed downward. At first the log did not move. William shifted his grip and leaned his weight against the lever. The branch creaked slightly. Then the trunk rolled a few inches. "Good," William said quietly. He repeated the movement again. Push, roll, push again. Slowly, the heavy log began inching across the clearing toward the centre where he had placed his marker stick. The process required patience and a fair bit of muscle. But little by little the trunk moved. Sweat formed along William's brow despite the cool mountain air. The work warmed his body quickly. Finally the log reached the spot where the first wall of the cabin would begin. William stood back and rested his hands on his hips. The single log resting there did not look like much yet. Just a long pine trunk lying across a patch of moss. But in William's mind he could already see the shape of the future cabin rising from the ground. 4 walls, a door, a roof of split logs and bark, a fireplace built from stone, shelter from the winter storms that would soon roll down from the northern mountains. Every cabin began with a single log, and now his was lying there in the centre of the clearing. William picked up the axe once more and walked to the end of the trunk. The next step would be the notches, small carved cuts in the ends of each log that allowed them to lock together at the corners of the cabin. Whitlock had shown him the method many times during the previous winter. A good notch held the logs tight. A bad notch left gaps, and gaps meant cold wind. William knelt beside the end of the log and studied it carefully. The blade of the axe rested across his knee while he visualized the shape of the cut. A simple saddle notch, strong, reliable, common among trappers and settlers alike. He raised the axe. The steel bit into the pine. The first notch of William's cabin had begun. The first corner notch. William rested the axe head gently against the log and stepped back for a moment. The freshly cut pine lay across the moss where he had rolled it earlier. Its pale wood glowed softly in the afternoon light, and the sharp scent of resin hung thick in the clearing. For a while he simply stood there studying it. Cabin building was not simply a matter of stacking logs one atop another. Every log needed to fit, and the corners were the most important part. Whitlock had explained that many times the winter before. Anybody can pile logs, the old trapper had said, but a cabin only stands straight if the corners are cut right. William walked to the end of the log and crouched beside it. The pine bark was rough beneath his fingers as he brushed away loose wood chips from where he had trimmed the branches. Beneath the bark, the wood felt smooth and firm. This end would form the first corner of the cabin wall. That meant it needed a notch. He lifted the axe and held it across the log for a moment, visualizing the shape in his mind before making the first strike. Whitlock had called it a saddle notch, a shallow curved hollow carved into the end of the log so the next log could sit securely across it. Wood against wood, gravity holding everything together. William drew a small line in the bark using the edge of his knife, just a simple mark, a guide for where the cut would begin. He raised the axe slowly. The blade fell with a solid crack as it bit into the pine. A small wedge of wood popped free and landed in the moss. William struck again, then again, each cut angled slightly toward the centre of the log, slowly forming the outer edges of the notch. Soon a rough groove began taking shape. He paused to brush the chips aside and leaned closer to study the cut. Not deep enough yet, but the shape was coming along. William shifted his stance and continued carving. This time he used shorter strokes, shaving away smaller pieces of wood instead of chopping large chunks. The process reminded him a little of shaping the axe handle earlier that day. Slow, careful, controlled. Piece by piece the notch grew smoother. Whitlock had always said that patience mattered more than strength during this part of the work. "A good notch holds the whole cabin together," he had told him. "A bad one lets the wind in." William chuckled quietly to himself at the memory. The old trapper would likely find several faults in his work if he were standing here now. Still, the notch was beginning to look right. The curved hollow followed the grain of the pine neatly. He ran his fingers along the cut, smooth enough and deep enough that the next log would rest firmly inside it. William leaned back on his heels and wiped his hands on his coat. The first corner notch of his cabin was finished. He stood slowly and stretched his back. The sun had dropped lower while he worked. Long shadows stretched across the clearing now, and the air carried the cool breath of evening drifting down from the hills. William stepped back and studied the single log resting in place. One log, one notch, the smallest beginning of a cabin. But every shelter built in the wilderness started exactly the same way. One tree, then another, then another. Given enough time, those trees would become walls strong enough to hold back the winter winds. William rested the axe across his shoulder and looked around the clearing once more. Tomorrow he would cut the next log, and once 2 notched logs crossed at the corners, the cabin would truly begin to take shape among the pines. William remained standing in the clearing for a few moments after finishing the first notch. The pine log rested quietly in its place, the carved hollow at its end catching a thin beam of afternoon sunlight that slipped through the branches above. For a while he simply looked at it. The work so far had been small compared to what still needed doing. A cabin required dozens of logs before the walls reached a man's height, and even more before the roof could be laid across the top, but the first piece was always the hardest. Once the work began, the rest followed. William shifted the axe in his hands and turned back toward the fallen trunk that still stretched across the forest floor. The pine had been tall, long enough that several more good logs could be cut from it before he needed to fell another tree. He walked along its length, studying the wood carefully. Straight grain, few knots, strong timber. He stopped where the next 12-foot section would begin and marked the bark again with the edge of his knife. Whitlock had once explained the importance of keeping the logs the same length. "If your logs wander," the old trapper had said, "your walls wander too." Crooked walls made crooked roofs. Crooked roofs made trouble once the snow began piling up. William lifted the axe. The blade struck the trunk with a deep crack. Wood chips jumped from the cut. He settled into the rhythm again. Swing, strike, pull free. The sound carried softly through the trees as the notch in the trunk deepened. The new ash handle held firm beneath his grip. It flexed slightly with each strike, absorbing the force in a way that made the work easier on his hands. Soon the cut reached halfway through the trunk. William paused to wipe sweat from his brow. Even in the cool mountain air, the labour warmed his body quickly. He raised the axe again and finished the cut. With a final crack, the log separated from the trunk and rolled slightly to one side. William set the axe down and nudged the wood with his boot. Heavy, every bit as heavy as the first. Moving it would take patience again. He cut another sturdy branch nearby and slid it beneath the log just as Whitlock had shown him. Using the branch as a lever, he pressed downward with steady pressure. The trunk shifted, rolled, then settled again. William adjusted his grip and pushed once more. Little by little, the log began creeping across the clearing. The moss beneath it helped. Soft ground allowed the heavy timber to slide more easily than bare soil would have. Still, the work demanded effort. William leaned his shoulder against the trunk and pushed. The log rolled another few inches, then again. Sweat dampened the collar of his coat. His breathing grew heavier, but slowly the log reached the first one resting at the centre of the clearing. William stepped back and rested his hands on his hips. 2 logs now lay on the ground, the first already notched, the second waiting for its turn. The small stick marking the centre of the cabin still stood nearby, and William could already imagine the first corner rising where the 2 logs would cross. He crouched beside the second log and ran his hand across the bark. Tomorrow he would carve its notch. Then he would lift it into place across the first. Once that happened, the cabin would truly begin. 2 crossed logs formed the first corner, 4 corners formed the frame, and the frame held everything else. William stood again and looked toward the sky. The sun had nearly reached the tops of the western hills now. The forest light had softened into the deep amber colour that came only at the end of the day. It was time to head back to camp. He lifted the axe and rested it across his shoulder once more. Behind him, the 2 pine logs lay quietly in the clearing, waiting for the next day's work. The first pieces of William's winter cabin had begun taking shape among the trees, and with a few more days of steady labour, those logs would become walls strong enough to stand against the mountain winter. William gave the 2 logs one last look before turning away from the clearing. They rested quietly where he had rolled them into place, long and straight across the moss. The notch carved into the first log caught the fading light of the afternoon sun, a small hollow that marked the true beginning of the cabin walls. It was not much yet, just 2 pieces of pine lying in the forest. But William could already imagine the rest, logs rising one upon another, corners locking together, a roof overhead, a fire burning safely inside while winter winds howled outside the walls. The thought brought a faint smile to his face. He shifted the axe across his shoulder and began walking downhill toward the river. The forest had grown quieter during the last hour. The bright sounds of afternoon birds had faded, replaced by the softer rhythms that came as evening approached. A distant crow called somewhere beyond the trees, its rough voice echoing across the valley before fading into silence again. William stepped carefully through the moss and fallen needles. The ground here was soft beneath his boots, and the air carried the rich scent of pine sap where the trees he'd cut earlier still bled slowly from their stumps. When he reached the stream, he paused. The water moved gently over smooth stones, catching the amber light of the setting sun. The clearing above him had been a good choice for the cabin. Water close by, plenty of timber, and enough open ground to keep snow from piling too deeply against the walls once winter arrived. Whitlock would have approved of the location. William crossed the stream with a few careful steps and continued down toward the river valley. The walk felt slower now that the day's work had ended. His shoulders carried the comfortable ache that came from honest labour. The muscles in his arms still tingled faintly from hours of swinging the axe. It was a good feeling, the kind that reminded a man he had done something worthwhile with the day. The river appeared through the trees soon after. Its dark water reflected the last streaks of sunset as the sky above the valley turned gradually from gold to deep blue. William stepped across the same line of flat stones he had used that morning. The cold water slid quietly beneath his boots as he crossed. On the far bank, the small clearing of his camp came into view. A faint glow flickered among the trees where the coals of his fire still waited inside the circle of stones. William walked into camp and set the axe down beside the stump where he usually split kindling. Then he knelt beside the fire pit and stirred the coals gently with a stick. The embers glowed bright red beneath the ash. Still alive. Good, he said quietly. He added a few pieces of the pine kindling he had gathered earlier that afternoon. The wood caught quickly. Thin flames rose again, casting warm light across the clearing. William held his hands near the fire and let the warmth creep slowly into his fingers. The evening air had grown colder already. Autumn nights in the mountains never wasted time. Before long, the first stars began appearing through the branches above. William leaned back against a fallen log beside the fire. The pelts drying against the nearby tree stirred slightly in the evening breeze. 3 good hides, 2 logs waiting in the clearing, and the first notch carved into the future wall of his cabin. Not a bad day's work. Tomorrow the second notch would be cut, and once the 2 logs crossed at the corners, the cabin would truly begin rising from the forest floor. William watched the flames dance quietly in the fire pit while darkness settled over the valley. The river whispered nearby, an owl called somewhere deep in the trees, and above the pines, the mountain sky filled slowly with stars. The frontier was quiet again, and tonight, with the first pieces of his winter shelter already waiting in the clearing above the stream. William the Trapper could rest, knowing that the work had truly begun. The fire burned low beside William's camp. Only a few glowing coals remained now, their soft red light flickering against the nearby trees. The river moved quietly through the darkness beyond the clearing, its steady whisper blending with the distant sounds of the forest at night. William lay beneath his blanket, staring up through the branches at the wide sky above. The stars had come out in full now, hundreds of them, perhaps thousands. Out here in the mountains they seemed brighter than anywhere he remembered from the settlements along the St. Lawrence River. The wilderness had a way of making the sky feel larger, and a man feel smaller. William shifted slightly on his bed of spruce boughs, the pleasant ache of the day's work settling into his shoulders. 2 logs cut, 1 notch carved, and the beginning of a cabin waiting quietly in the clearing above the stream. Not much yet, but enough to mark the start. Tomorrow he would return to the clearing, the second notch would be carved, the first corner of the cabin would rise, and once that corner stood, the rest of the walls would slowly follow. The fire crackled softly beside him as the last embers faded. Somewhere deep in the forest an owl called once more. Then the valley returned to quiet, and beneath the cold stars of the frontier sky, William the Trapper drifted peacefully into sleep,